Boldwood presents Sinister Stranger at St Bride's, written by Debbie Young and read by Laura Kerman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Andrew Marvell. Better to know the truth than fear what it might be. Miss Hairnet, headmistress of St Bride's School for Girls. Chapter 1. Gemma meets a ghost. Miss Lamb! Miss Lamb! There's a ghost outside the front door! At St Bride's School for Girls, I never quite knew what to expect when I opened the staff room door to deal with a girls' inquiry, but Imogen's announcement before the first lesson of the day was unprecedented. Foolish child, muttered Mavis Brooke, the geography teacher, from behind me, closing the exercise book she was marking. I blame that Halloween nonsense for putting such silly ideas into her head. Most unhealthy. The terror on Imogen's face made me loath to dismiss her claim as a prank, although that seemed more likely than her having seen a real ghost. I tried to make light of the situation to calm her down. Anyone's ghost in particular? Are you sure it's not just one of your friends in a white sheet? Imogen shook her head vigorously. Oh, no, miss. It's a real ghost, all right. You should see it. It's far too tall to be any of my friends. And it's a man. Imogen, aged 11, came up only as far as my shoulder, but there were some very tall girls in the top class of 17 to 18-year-olds. Might one of those have tried such a stunt? OK, Imogen, wait a moment, and I'll have a look out the staff room window to see whether it's still there. I closed the door. School policy is to keep the staff room private from the girls, and crossed to the big bay window that gave onto the forecourt. As I peered round to view the front porch, the doorbell rang for the second time in the last few minutes, and a tall, thin, dark-haired man with a wide-clipped moustache stepped back to look around for signs of life. Near me on the window seat, Oriana Bliss, head of maths, looked up from a stationery catalogue she had been browsing through and followed my gaze. He looks like flesh and blood to me. Well, you're the expert, said PE teacher Joe Sprike, unzipping his pink tracksuit top. Joe was a former competitive cyclist on the run from hostile journalists who unfairly blamed him for an international sports scandal. During term time, Joe disguised himself as a woman to escape detection. I narrowed my eyes to focus better on the stranger. I had to agree with Oriana. He looks familiar, but I don't think he's one of the girls' fathers, is he? Oriana laid her catalogue on the seat beside her. Not unless the Bursars signed up a new pupil during the half-term holiday. And speaking of the Bursar, where is he? Why isn't he answering that pesky doorbell? In the absence of a budget that would stretch to a receptionist, answering the door fell to the Bursar. When I first arrived, I assumed Max, as security officer, might assume this duty. But Max was like St Bride's own Scarlet Pimpernel. You never knew where he might pop up next, and it was often in the place you least expected. The Bursar was far more visible, an overt equivalent to Max's undercover agent, a kind of bouncer, perhaps. The bouncing Bursar. I smiled. Perhaps he wasn't so bad after all. Now I'd got used to him. The bell rang for the third time. Oriana glanced at the wall clock above the door, then at me. There was just a few minutes left before lessons began for the day. I took her hint. I suppose I can let him in myself, I sighed. Imogen, still waiting outside the staff room door, skipped alongside me as I strode down the corridor to the entrance hall. Oh, miss, you are brave. Do you want me to get a gang of girls to rescue you in case it's the dangerous kind of ghost? I tried not to hurt her dignity by laughing. She meant well. I'm sure I'll be fine, thank you. I don't think much harm can come to me answering the front door in broad daylight. Oh, yes, thank goodness it's daylight. That means he can't be a vampire. But I'll hide nearby just in case. If you need me, shout the code word. What should our code word be? After spending half-term with my parents, I hadn't yet returned to the girls' mindset. How about help? Imogen frowned. I don't think you're really trying, miss. When we reached the vast entrance hall that had so intimidated me on my arrival at the school back in September, Imogen took cover behind one of the broad marble pillars, supporting the ornate painted ceiling. I marched across the tiled floor, heels clicking, and heaved open the front door. "Good morning," I said, blinking against the pale November sunshine. "How can I help you, sir?" The stranger stepped forward, assuming I'd let him in. We did an awkward shuffle as I tried to stall him until I'd established his credentials. We were very hot on child protection at St Bride's. "Why, good morning to you, ma'am." The stranger spoke with a leisurely US drawl, with his dark moustache, black suit, brocade waistcoat and string tie. He reminded me of Clark Gable as Rep Butler in Gone with the Wind. Scarlett O'Hara would have felt right at home at St Bride's, with its ostentatious historic house and gardens, although our English weather couldn't compete with the southern sunshine at Tara, our family plantation estate. If the stranger was a belated trick-or-treater, his choice of costume was unusual. I kept my hand on the doorknob. I wasn't going to let him in without good reason. "Do you have an appointment, please?" "Why, thank you, ma'am. I surely do." He gave a slight bow. Was he mocking me with his elaborate southern charm? "And with whom might your appointment be, sir?" I'm not the kind of English teacher who is a stickler for whom in general conversation, but his formal speech was rubbing off on me. "With Miss Caroline Hairnet, your headmistress, if you please. I believe I am right on time." He patted the pocket in his waistcoat, from which hung a silver watch chain, fastened at the other end to a button. Holding the door open to allow him in, I pointed to the signing-in book on the table beside the sofa. "If you would be so kind as to write your name in our visitors' book, I'll give you a security badge and tell Miss Hairnet you're here." The stranger bent his head in acknowledgement and produced from his inside jacket pocket an engraved gold fountain pen. He signed his name in copper plate of such a size that it spilled over the edges of the signature box, yet the loops were so tightly closed that I couldn't make out what he'd written. "Whom shall I say is here for her? I mean who?" He added an ornate swirl of self-importance beneath his signature, then gazed up at me in feigned surprise, as if he were a celebrity recognised wherever he went. He straightened up, capped his pen, and returned it to its pocket. "My name is Bunting, Earl Bunting, and what a delight it is to be in my ancestral home at last." The gasp that issued from behind the pillar echoed my own surprise. Lord Bunting was the school's Victorian founder. According to the school prospectus, over 100 years before, he died without issue and decreed his house and grounds should be turned into a boarding school for girls. I was unsure how to address the stranger. "My lord? Your excellency? Your worship?" The school library's copy of Debrett's Peerage would tell me. We had plenty of titled girls on the roll, but it was school policy not to use those titles in daily life, so I'd never needed to swat up on the etiquette before. For now, I took the easy option. "Please have a seat, sir, and I'll tell Miss Hairnet you're here." As I marched off to the headmistress's study, Imogen came pattering after me. "Now do you believe me, miss? It's the ghost of Lord Bunting, isn't it? Didn't you recognise him?" The life-size oil painting of the school's founder on the wall of the assembly hall had made him a familiar figure to us all. Imogen skipped to overtake me, then turned and began walking backwards to face the way we'd come. "I'm going to the hall now to see if the picture's still there. Lord Bunting might have stepped down from it and turned real. That's the sort of thing that happens at Halloween. I've seen it before." "Really?" "Yes, in a play my grandma took me to see in the summer holidays. There were lots of songs in it, and all the paintings came to life." "That'll be radical," came a voice behind us. Louisa Humber, the music teacher, was on her way to her classroom. "It's an operetta, Imogen, not a play by Gilbert and Sullivan." Imogen shrugged. "Anywho, my point is, there's probably now a big empty hole in the painting where Lord Bunting used to be." Louisa flashed a conspiratorial smile at me. "Let me know if your ghost bursts into song," she said, amused, then walked on. "Off you go then, Imogen," I encouraged her. I hoped that when she found the painting intact, she would feel reassured. "But be as quick as you can, or you'll be late for your lesson." "Yes, Miss Lamb." Not wanting to be late for my lesson either, I hastened down the private corridor to the headmistress's secluded study and rapped on her door. "Come in," came her cheery greeting. I went in to find Miss Hairnet sitting at her desk, contentedly opening her half-term post. Through the bay window behind her lay a neat rose garden, pruned and orderly for the winter. McPhee, her black cat, lay on his side on the window seat, basking in a beam of autumn sunshine, legs stretched out for maximum exposure to the warmth. He was a substantial cat. She, officially. McPhee was female, like all the teaching staff, for the sake of consistency in the school's all-girl publicity strategy. "Good morning, my dear. I trust you have had an enjoyable break." "Thank you, yes. I felt like one of the girls going home to see my parents, but it was lovely." Unlike the girls, I hadn't seen my parents for a few years due to a disastrous relationship with my controlling ex, Stephen, from whom I'd fled to this job and some vestige of security. At last, I was starting to make up for lost time. I'd be returning to my parents for the Christmas holidays, too. "What can I do for you this morning, my dear?" The pleasure of being back in the headmistress's comforting company had almost made me forget the stranger. "You have a visitor, Miss Hairnet. He's waiting in the entrance hall. He claims he has an appointment with you." She glanced at the large hardback diary that lay open on her desk. Her smile faded. Yes, so he does. Please escort him to my study." She didn't ask his name. When I'd retraced my steps to the entrance hall, where I found the stranger gazing up at the ornate painted ceiling, I saw him with fresh eyes. His resemblance to the original Lord Bunting was inescapable. I coughed to attract his attention. "Miss Hairnet will see you now." I raised a hand to indicate the direction of her study. His reverie interrupted. He stood up and straightened his silk tie. When we passed the foot of the curving marble staircase that led to the residential part of the school, he patted the finial fondly. As he followed me down the oak-panelled corridor to the headmistress's study, he whistled in admiration. "It's quite a place we have here," he said in a low voice, as much to himself as to me. "We?" I wondered at his choice of pronoun, but made no comment. I knocked on Miss Hairnet's door, waited for permission to enter, then held it wide for him to go in. The headmistress rose from her desk and crossed the crimson Persian carpet to greet him. Instantly alert, McPhee leapt down from the window seat and followed at Miss Hairnet's heels, his tail bushy with hostility. "Ah, Mr. Bunting, I've been expecting you." Eyes wide, I withdrew and left them to it, just as the bell rang for the first lesson. I would have to wait until morning break to update my colleagues about this mysterious stranger. Chapter 2. White Night. "Bunting. His name's Bunting, and he's an earl." In the staff room at break, I blurted out the news with the breathless excitement that often accompanied the girls' more outlandish announcements. Joe lowered his newspaper. "I should think he would have to be a member of the nobility to afford such a flash car as that. Or a media mogul, or a financier, or a film star. Someone loaded anyway. Have you seen it, Gemma?" He got up from his habitual armchair and led me to the window, his guiding hand gentle on my shoulder. It felt good to physically connect with him again. Before half-term, we'd been on the brink of striking up a romantic relationship, but I was unsure now post-Stephen. I wasn't going to rush into a new relationship on the rebound. All the same, I was glad he kept his hand on my shoulder as he pointed to a gleaming white Rolls Royce on the forecourt. Wow! I couldn't contain my admiration, although I wasn't surprised at the calibre of the car, given Earl Bunting's expensive tailoring and fancy fountain pen. Joe grinned. "And get that licence plate." I read it aloud. BL155. It took me a moment to realise what he meant. Then I shouted across the staff room, "Oriana, come and look at this!" Oriana had just come into the staff room and was helping herself to a drink from Old Faithful, the dependable but dangerous staff room coffee machine. Sipping her coffee, she strolled languidly to the window. But the sight of the car perked her up more than any amount of caffeine could. She flushed with pleasure. BL155. "Oh, Bliss! That's me. Whose is it? I want it." Her eyes gleamed more than the car. Oriana was a pushover for a fancy car at the best of times, so a fancy car with a personalised number plate perfect for her was bound to appeal. As a former professional cyclist, Joe was less easily impressed. He preferred 2 wheels for transport. With an indulgent smile, he shook his head and returned to his armchair, leaving me to fill in the details for her. By now, I knew Oriana well enough to tease her a little. What's more, it comes with a title. Earl Bunting. He had an appointment with Hairnet this morning. Oriana's head jerked back in astonishment. Really? A title as well as a posh car. She was probably already picturing their wedding. The Rolls-Royce would make an excellent wedding car. Judith Gosling, head of history, came over to join us, clutching her week's post just retrieved from her pigeonhole. He can't be the current Lord Bunting, if that's what you're thinking. Judith was our resident expert on genealogy and the author of a slim book about the school's history. Oriana turned on Judith crossly. Are you sure? Judith didn't let Oriana's brusque tone upset her. When Miss Hairnet asked me to draw up the Bunting family tree for the school website a few years ago, it ended with our founder. Poor Lord Bunting's family tree was fairly coppiced. Like so many Victorian parents, his marriage wasn't without issue, and no children survived him. Shame, really. I got the impression he would have been a good father, at least by the standards of his day. That's odd. This new Earl Bunting was talking like he owned the place, or at least had a claim to it, although I did find it strange that he had an American accent. Judith raised her eyebrows. Really? The family didn't stray much from the Cotswolds, never mind as far as America. Even with all that wealth at his disposal, Lord Bunting only ever went to London for business meetings about his inventions and for his parliamentary duties. What sort of American accent was it? In my head, I replayed my conversation with the stranger. Deep South, I'd say. Judith tapped her handful of post on the table in thought. There was a time when a wealthy British family might have invested in tobacco or sugar or cotton plantations in the Americas and sent a son to run it, she said. But Bunting's was a sparse dynasty. I can't think of anyone in his family who might have done that. In any case, my impression is that he was a decent man who would have had no truck with the slave trade, thank goodness. I gather he had no children in any case, I put in. No known surviving children at any rate. His only legitimate child to live beyond babyhood died when he was 9. Poor little soul. This was sad news. But you should see this fellow, Judith, I persisted. He's the spitting image of Lord Bunting's portrait, even down to the cut of his clothes and the shape of his moustache. And he did introduce himself as Earl Bunting. Surely he must be some kind of relation. Judith slipped her post in her book bag. Whether or not he's related makes no difference. Bunting was only a life peer. His title died with him, whether or not he had children. Besides which, he was never an earl. An earldom is hereditary. If you're an earl, you're Earl of somewhere, such as Earl Wendlebury, which would have been Bunting's obvious choice, given how much he loved the place. But even then, he wouldn't have introduced himself as Earl Wendlebury, nor would you address him as that. You'd say either my lord or Lord Wendlebury. Like the poet Byron, I noted. George Gordon, Lord Byron. That makes sense. I thought it odd that Hairnet called him Mr. Bunting, and that her infallible curtsy reflex in the presence of nobility didn't kick in. Joe laughed from behind his newspaper. You've been had, Gemma. I bet he's no more an earl than I am. You know what these Americas are like with their names. His mother must have had delusions of grandeur. He probably puts Roman numerals after his name too, Earl Bunting III or some such, because his forebears lacked the imagination to name him anything different from his father or grandfather. How to quash a child's individuality from birth in one fell swoop. Gazing at the white Rolls-Royce, Oriana sighed like a deflating wedding balloon. I'd still like a ride in that car, though. Reluctantly, she tore herself away from the window to return her coffee cup to the trolley. Joe grinned. "Nobody's stopping you, Oriana. I bet you can wangle a ride in the Blissmobile if you tell this Bunting guy your name." Before she could accept the challenge, the staff room door was flung wide open and Felicity Button, head of Essential Life Skills, entered bearing a plate of gingerbread stars. She proceeded to tour the room, offering them to us in turn. Judith was first to help herself. 8, said Felicity to Judith, who looked as if it meant something to her. Felicity held out the plate to me. "Go on, take a handful while they're warm. Gentle on the teeth this way, too. Gingerbread hardens as it cools." I didn't need to be asked twice, but Oriana, apparently back on her dating diet, declined and diverted Felicity's attention to Mr. Bunting's car. "Look at this, Felicity. A Rolls Royce with my name on it." Felicity went to join her at the window. "Who gave you that, then? You must have had a successful half-term?" Oriana stiffened. "Actually, I'm between beaux," was her prim reply, before she weakened and took a biscuit. "Though I'm hoping to meet the owner of that little beauty once Hairnet's done with him." Felicity stared at the car in thought. "While you're at it, could you please ask him whether he'll let my car maintenance class have a glimpse under the bonnet? That's my next lesson. Rolls-Royce would make an interesting change from my Mini. Besides, most of our girls are more likely to drive a big posh car than a hatchback when they grow up." Miss Button's portfolio was very broad, from cookery to car maintenance, from how to vote to how to fill in a tax return or a betting slip. I wished I'd had Miss Button when I was at school. "What a splendid subject for the last car maintenance lesson of the autumn term," Felicity continued. "Not that I'm lacking in enticing class topics. For the rest of this term, my classes will be focused on food. Christmas pudding, Christmas cake, brandy butter, mince pies, stollen, panettone. Yum." My hands went involuntarily to my waist. Thanks to school dinners, I'd put on several kilos since joining the staff. "And we'll get to sample them all, Gemma," said Joe, patting his tummy, enviably taut beneath his tracksuit. "There have to be some perks to this job." I rather hoped he might prove to be one of mine before the Christmas term was out. Chapter 3. The Day of the Dead. "Well, it is the Day of the Dead," Imogen was saying as I took my seat at the head of my lunch table in the trough, the girls' dining room. "Does that mean we have to hold a funeral?" asked one of her friends. "Bagsy, not me as human sacrifice," said another. "Can't we bury a dead beetle or something instead?" As I drew in my chair, the girls started to hand round big dishes of a luscious-looking casserole, creamy mashed potatoes, and steamed broccoli with toasted almonds. Joe had told me the food was always better following a break. The school cook, Rosemary, must have been in a good mood after a holiday with her husband, Max Security. I tried not to let the sumptuous spread distract me from my pastoral duties. Girls, that's not how the Day of the Dead works at all." All eyes around our table fixed on me. "Really, miss?" asked Imogen. "Are you an expert on the Day of the Dead?" "I'm no expert, but I know a little about it from my RE GCSE. We studied religious rites and rituals around the world, and the Day of the Dead was one of them. It takes place the day after All Saints' Day, so 2 days after Halloween." "We know all about Halloween, Miss Lamb," said Grace. The bulging bags of trick-or-treat bounty they'd brought back after half-term proved her point. "The Day of the Dead is a Mexican tradition," I continued. "It celebrates family and friends who have passed away. There are solemn prayers, but also lots of fun, such as fancy dress processions, music, dancing, and special food and drink. Shrines are set up with photos and candles to remember lost loved ones. It's a happy occasion, really." Imogen's hand was shaking as she filled my water glass from the jug. "Do the dead come back to life to join in?" I gave what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "No, they don't." Spooning casserole onto my plate from the dish that Imogen was holding out to me, I chose my words carefully. Many of the girls at St Bride's were half-orphaned, having lost their mothers at least. Motherless pupils received a discount on school fees, as stipulated by Lord Bunting in his will, for reasons best known to himself. If you've ever lost anyone, and I know a lot of you have, you'll know you can't help but think about them long after they've gone. Sometimes it feels as if they've never really left you, and as if they're watching over you. You could say they are still with you in spirit, but that's not the same thing as there being ghosts. And there's nothing spooky or scary about that. The girls remained silent, giving me their full attention, so I carried on. After all, we are the product of those who love us and care for us. It's natural they should always feel part of our lives. I lost my grandparents when I was about your age, and I still think about them a lot. Sometimes in my dreams I go to tea with them, as I used to do when I was little, and I wake up peaceful and contented. The girls had hardly touched their food, so I thought I'd better bring this conversation to a close. So it's a good, positive thing to have a special day to celebrate them. Mexicans see the Day of the Dead as a day of joy and happiness, just as we see the birthdays of those who are still with us. Now, let's get on with our lunch, please, or you'll have no time to play before next lesson. The rest of the meal passed without further event. Most of the girls deepened thought about what I'd said. I loved it when that happened. Not the silence, but the feeling that I'd made a mark on the girls. Moments like this confirmed my impression that I'd made the right career choice at last. I'd come to understand how Miss Hairnet, with decades of such experiences to her credit, cared so passionately about St Bride's. Her dedication was infectious. As I crossed the assembly hall to the staff room for post-lunch coffee, I couldn't help but glance up at Lord Bunting's portrait, just to check he was still there. As ever, Lord Bunting, whose deep brown eyes followed you around the room, smiled at me benignly down his aquiline nose, flanked by high cheekbones. His lips were lean, but his mouth wide beneath the neat moustache that arched like a third eyebrow. It was a patrician face, although his title had been bestowed on him as a reward for his most renowned invention, rather than by birthright. The school community took a vicarious pride in Lord Bunting's chief claim to fame, not the construction of the beautiful house and grounds we now called home, but his standing as a prominent Victorian engineer. He invented a highly effective tunnelling machine that played a major part in the construction of railways throughout the country and across the former British Empire. He'd also deployed his patented machine to build a series of tunnels on his home turf. A man-sized rabbit warren honeycombed the St Bride's estate, now invaluable for max security when patrolling the grounds. Scrutinising Lord Bunting's portrait, I couldn't help but see the image of our visitor. Yet despite the physical resemblance, there were some significant differences. Earl's lips were straight and unsmiling, and his deep brown eyes lacked the kindly twinkle of his supposed ancestors. As I headed for the staff room, I shivered. The school had not yet returned to its normal temperature after the week's closure for half-term. The Bursar scuttled behind me, overtaking me just in time to open the staff room door. We hadn't hit it off when I first joined the school, so when I realised he was holding the door open for me, I was glad to see he wasn't bearing any grudges. I turned to smile at him as I crossed the threshold. "Thanks, Bursar." I'd quickly fallen into the quaint school habit of addressing him by his title. Some staff called Miss Hairnet headmistress as well. The tradition had seemed odd at first, but I soon got used to it. Even so, I was glad that the girls called the teachers by their title and surname, or just Miss for short. The Bursar followed me across the staff room to Old Faithful. "I hear I missed an interesting visitor this morning, Gemma. Thank you for taking care of him. I had no idea he was expected, or I'd have stayed close at hand." I poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him before filling a cup for myself. "It's not like Miss Hairnet to forget an appointment," he continued. "Actually, she was expecting him. Maybe she wanted to keep his visit confidential, though I don't know why." His brow crinkled with worry. "Is he still here?" "I don't know, but we can soon find out. Let's see if his car's still on the forecourt." Before we could reach the window to check, Miss Hairnet entered the staff room with Earl Bunting, McPhee at her heels. The room fell silent. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen." Her voice sounded formal, and a few notes higher than usual. "We have a visitor. Please welcome to St Bride's, Mr. Earl Bunting." He's going to be with us for some time. Chapter 4. Musical Chairs. The bursar took a step forward. When you say some time, headmistress, how long do you mean exactly? Miss Hairnet glanced at Earl Bunting, checking his reaction before answering. His expression gave nothing away. Why, as long as he wishes, bursar. And the good news is that he's decided to stay on site, so that he can spend as much time as possible acquainting himself with the estate to which he has staked his claim. A slight twitch played beneath the bursar's right eye. Really, headmistress? I'm not sure of the propriety of allowing a strange man to stay in the same building as the girls. Miss Hairnet was a little too quick to reply. I'm sure you have no reason to worry about our guest, bursar, given his pedigree. And it's not as if he'll be sleeping in the school. The bursar let out a sigh of relief. My apologies, headmistress. I misunderstood. So where will he be sleeping? At the Bluebird? The pub in the nearby village of Wendlebury Barrow offered bed and breakfast, a service popular with visiting parents. Miss Hairnet deployed her most charming smile. In your house, bursar, just as soon as you've had the chance to move your things up to the old butler's quarters in the attic. You'll be fine up there for the time being, and I've asked Jerry to give it a good spring clean for you. Jerry Brompton is our housekeeper, Mr. Bunting, an experienced hotelier, and a much-valued member of our team. The bursar's mouth fell open, but no words came out. He could hardly object without casting doubt on his own suitability to be in close proximity to the girls. Miss Hairnet wasn't daft. She had him in checkmate. That's mighty kind of you, sir, said Earl Bunting. However, it'll be a while before my possessions arrive from the States, so I'd thank you to leave your furniture in place. Miss Hairnet answered on the bursar's behalf. Of course. The butler's old furniture is in his flat, so the bursar can make do with that and leave his furniture for you. As Miss Hairnet and Earl Bunting left the room, Mavis got up from her chair and made a beeline for the bursar. Come on, bursar, I'm free next period. Let me give you a hand with moving your stuff. Linking her arm through his in solidarity, she led him from the staff room, leaving the rest of us to ponder on the news. Joe was first to break the ensuing silence. That's a slap in the face for the poor old bursar. He must feel like he's been demoted. At least it keeps Earl Bunting away from the girls at night, I observed, and no more than a stone's throw from Max, so he shouldn't be able to get into any mischief. Besides, isn't the old butler's flat just along from yours? So he'll have you for company. Yes, I'll do what I can to cheer him up, said Joe. I wonder why Earl wants to stay at the school anyway, said Felicity. His supposed family connection, said Judith, which wouldn't seem unreasonable, except I'm unsure where he fits into the family tree, at least the legitimate part of it. So what do you propose to do about it? Snapped Oriana. Run a DNA test? I can't see Hairnet giving you permission to open up Lord Bunting's tomb to get a sample for comparison. Besides, I think you're all too cynical for words. With all the genes in the world, the chance of someone unrelated turning up out of the blue with such an unmistakable resemblance to our founder is minuscule. Who's to say Lord Bunting didn't have a son or a daughter born out of wedlock to keep his genes from extinction? She flushed and her eyes widened. Not that there's anything wrong with that these days, said Joe, seeming to sense her embarrassment. Joe, the bursar, and I were the only staff members to know that Oriana was Miss Hairnet's illegitimate daughter. It would have to have been a son to continue the family name, observed the ever-practical Judith. Let me see what I can find out. I've still got my research notes from the family tree project. The bell rang for the next lesson, and we filed out of the staff room, heading for the classroom courtyard. I strolled across the quad with Felicity, who had changed out of her chef whites and harlequin apron into royal blue mechanic's overalls. What did you think of our visitor? She asked me on the way. I thought for a moment. I don't trust him. He seems a bit smarmy to me. Felicity mimicked his American accent. Maybe you're not used to such divine southern manners, honey. I grinned. Anyone can talk like that if they try. It doesn't make them a gentleman or a relative of one. Besides, how come he's so very similar to the man he claims to be his ancestor? He looks as if he has 100% of Lord Bunting's genes, yet he's many generations removed. I don't need to be head of science to know that with every generation, Lord Bunting's genes would have been diluted by 50%, the other half coming from each descendant's other parent. Earl Bunting's percentage of the original must be in single figures. Felicity nodded. It's just like homeopathy or baking sourdough bread from a starter batch. By the time you're on your 6th mix, there's hardly any of the original left at all. I loved sourdough bread. I hoped it was on the girls' cookery curriculum this term. Oriana caught up with us, smiling beatifically. All sorted. He's taking me out in his car on my next afternoon off. I covered my mouth with my hand to hide my smile. You haven't wasted any time? She shrugged. Well, why not? I've always thought Lord Bunting looked rather dashing. Never thought I'd have the chance to go on a date with him, though. Oh, and Felicity, he said you can take your girls out to check under the hood this afternoon, if you like. The rest of the car will be locked. How generous he is. And how fickle you are, I thought, mentally translating hood to bonnet. Oriana had chameleon tendencies when she was dating, echoing her latest boyfriend's persona. Felicity turned off into her mechanic's workshop, and I lingered outside Oriana's classroom to finish our conversation, the girls filing past us for their next lesson. But honestly, don't you find him a bit odd, Oriana? I could understand if he'd inherited a few distinguishing family features, the aquiline nose or elegant cheekbones, perhaps, but not the whole thing, down to the cut of his moustache. You of all people, and Joe, as our resident masters of disguise, should know better than to set such store by appearances alone. Oriana was constantly giving herself a complete makeover to suit her target man of the moment. When I'd first met her, she'd been sporting an elegant look based on the late wife of an eligible widower she'd set her sights on, a father of one of our pupils. As for Joe, growing his hair out of the aerodynamic close crop he'd favoured when cycling competitively and dressing in women's sports gear, had become a surprisingly successful disguise. Oh, don't be so stuffy, Gemma. You're so unromantic. Hairnet has everything in hand. She's calling an emergency governors meeting tomorrow to check his authenticity. It'll make a nice change for them to put their legal knowledge to good use. Given the average age of our ancient governors, I wasn't sure how helpful they would be. Chapter 5. All in the Family. When Oriana drifted into the staff room for coffee after supper, she had a certain glow about her, and it wasn't down to the delicious chicken curry we'd just eaten. Where were you at afternoon break? I asked, trying to not sound accusing. I fielded a phone call for you from the organiser of some inter-school maths competition, but I couldn't find you anywhere. It was notoriously difficult to catch staff on the phone during the school day, so callers usually booked appointments to speak to teachers in their free time. Oriana waved a hand dismissively as she headed for Old Faithful. Sorry, Gemma, I'd forgotten I told that woman to call me today. She poured a conciliatory cup for me too. Blame Hairnet. She asked me to take Earl Bunting on a tour of the grounds. Although once we got going, he said he hardly needed showing round. It was all coming back to him, like muscle memory across the generations. That seemed a bit rich. How gullible did he think Oriana was? Hoping to extract more inside information about him, I was careful not to make her clam up. I tried to think of something positive to say about their arrangement. I kept my voice light and casual. He had a beautiful afternoon for it. After lunch, the sun had broken through the grey blanket of cloud for half an hour, making the damp lawns and foliage sparkle. What did he make of the mausoleum? The mausoleum was a small stone building in the grounds, housing the tomb of Lord Bunting. His memorial plinth bore a startlingly lifelike marble effigy, which looked as if he was just